Okay, now the way we're going to run today's session is that we will do it as what we'll call a fireside chat with Peter Crawford and Ronan. I'll be asking questions, receiving their responses, and we'll be having a discussion for about 45 or 50 minutes. And then when we finish, Pierre has offered to provide a wrap-up, bringing the session together, discussing the broader international economy and business trends that are pushing for what we're calling the reimagining of the current trade agenda, and also talk about where and how politics feeds into this. And Pierre will have 15 minutes or so to wrap up the session. And then we'll be asking, for the final 15 minutes or so, questions from the audience. Now, I think you're aware that through your WCO app, you can ask questions electronically. And I do have an iPad up here, and if everything works well, I'll be receiving questions through there. But we'll also provide the opportunity for people to ask questions from the floor. We'll have a roving microphone and be able to move around to receive your questions. All right, well, with that, I think we will get started. Now, professional services, including accountancy services, are subject to international rules on trade. So it's a very active time for the international trade liberalisation agenda. And as the global economy continues to integrate and embrace today's demands for commercial infrastructure based on global value chains, the appreciation and realisation of opportunities and challenges in doing business around the world continue to grow. But the problem is, and the challenge is, that many of the rules that govern international trade and investment, and particularly those connected to the services economy, and for example, the General Agreement on Trade in Services, which is abbreviated to GATS, no longer reflect the current environment and demands, and these rules need to evolve. So with that in mind, I'll direct my first questions to both Peter and Crawford. I'd be grateful if you could provide your perspectives on this evolving international economic policy and trade dynamic, including what is it that the current rules cannot address, and what is it about these rules that are out of date? So Peter, if you could go first.
Well, thank you very much, and thank the audience for participating this afternoon. I think that as we start this discussion, it's important to realize that we're in the midst of two revolutions. One is the services revolution, and it is a revolution that is having as big an impact on the way we work and the way we live as the Industrial Revolution 100, 150 years ago. And you can see that in the statistics right off, that about 70% of world GDP is in services. And it's about the same percentage of world employment. Something like 3.2 billion people are employed in services. But to tell you the truth, impressive as those numbers are, the real revolution is the integration of services in all other aspects of the economy. Every other part of the economy, whether it is manufacturing or agriculture or energy, depends on a whole array of services to meet their objectives. And so this is what I mean by the services revolution. And you certainly see that in international trade. At the center of the services revolution is the digital revolution. And we're all obviously very familiar with that we are using digital techniques and the whole internet in ways that were unimaginable 10 or certainly 20 years ago. And so that is where the world trading system has failed to keep up. That the rules that were negotiated in the 1990s for the GATS didn't contemplate the way the digital economy has developed. When you think about it, I think that Amazon.com was only developed in 1994. And then I guess it is Google and that whole phenomenon, Facebook rather, is only 10 years old. So the whole economy has changed in ways that were not anticipated at all by the negotiators at the time of the GATS 20 years ago. And so there needs to be an updating of the trade system, of the rules of international trade. And that means a number of things. First of all, it means that the internet and the way of delivering services digitally needs to be addressed. We're also seeing that, the whole phenomenon of global value chains, and services are an integral part of that. We're also seeing in certain areas, perhaps not so much in accountancy, a much more involvement by state-owned or state-sponsored enterprises in the commercial space. And so all of these phenomena need to be taken into account in setting up the new trade rules. And of course, a lot of these have to do with regulatory matters, or whether there even should be more regulation. And we can talk about this later in terms of the internet. And the internet, of course, is primarily unregulated. And so these are the sorts of things that trade negotiators are having to grapple with, and countries are going to have to having to grapple with as they work in their own countries, but also internationally.
Thank you, Peter. And Crawford?
Well, thanks, Gary, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be here to talk with you. I'm probably going to do something which is anathema in front of a group of accountants, and that is to confess, to begin with, that I'm going to exaggerate. Only slightly, I assure you. And certainly I'm quite happy to have bilateral discussions with anybody outside who wants to look more into the detail and to make sure that the data is correct. But I'm only slightly exaggerating, and only slightly for effect. And that is that, in answer to Gary's question, the way I would look at it is the world has fundamentally changed in the way in which it does business. Now, when I say fundamentally changed, it's not changed out of all recognition, but I think it's more than just a question of marginal degree. The trade rules that we inherited, and which still are the trade rules that exist, were essentially related to national production. People still conceived of doing business as doing business was something you made in your own economy. You made it here and you shipped it there. That's the concept. So all of those things that trade negotiators deal with and have dealt with, and the way in which the rules were built up, was to reflect that world. Now, it was never that simple. There was always international trade, and there were always connections, and it was always the case that goods were exported and were further manufactured. But over the last 20 years, it has been thoroughly transformed to the extent that it's almost irrelevant now to have trade rules that are based essentially on conceptions of national production, because people do business globally. It's always been the case that at the national level, if you apply taxes to your imports, you're actually affecting your own competitiveness. But now it's totally changed because the perspective, these global value chains that Gary and Peter were mentioning, mean that the way in which any production process operates is across borders. So when the goods are traded between one economy and another, they're being traded as part of a vast production network, and they're going to cross borders several times. And having a national perspective doesn't help you very much, because the tariffs that you impose at the border in one particular economy aren't just a cost on your consumers, because the product isn't being consumed in your economy, because the product's going to be on-sold from your economy to a further economy, which is then going to be processed again. So the tariffs become cumulative. So from a business perspective, it doesn't make sense to be thinking about the way in which national economies look at their industrial and tariff policies. It's a horizontal way of looking at it. And Pascal Lamy, who was the former Director General of the WTO, I think he gets attributed with this, I don't know whether he actually said it, but he talks about products that are made in the world. And that is the way in which products are made now. So if that's the way the real world economy is moving, having trade rules which reflect an old world economy is a problem. It's not an insurmountable problem. The real world economy deals with it, But if you're going to look at the way in which you should properly organise your trade rules, you'd have a totally different perspective on it. We don't have the time probably to go into all the details of that now, but there are some guidelines that one can talk about. Peter's put his finger on it. I would say it's all about services, stupid, is perhaps the way I would look at it. If you look at trade and services, people say, well, look, Peter mentioned the figure, 70% of the economy services. But what's traded, only 22%. So there's a problem there. In a sense there is, but it's only because we haven't accounted for where that services trade is coming from. In actual fact, if you take a different perspective, which is where the value is added, now, I don't want to get too technical, but essentially when goods are produced, if they're shipped from one economy to another, there's not a lot of point counting as imports and exports stuff that you're simply assembling and sending on. What really matters is the value that you add in your national economy along the way, because that's where you're getting the real benefit. So when you take the value-added perspective on what's being traded, which is a totally new way of thinking about these things, it tells you a different story. And it tells you that, in actual fact, services are the crucial export factor for competitiveness, because something that if it's looked at in isolation comes to only 22%. When you take into account the way in which services are embodied in manufactured goods, i.e. making them competitive, services exports in value-added terms are at 50% or more of international trade. So the real perspective for policymakers should be, certainly for businesses it is, go where the value added is highest. And the reason why that value added is high, and a major contributor to it, is in fact competitive international services. Now, that covers a multitude of sectors. Obviously, it includes what I'd call services that are external to the manufacturing process, like transport and distribution. But then there are ones that are intrinsic to it, which develop value as well, like design. But there are financial services and professional services, of which accounting obviously is one, are absolutely crucial in that process. So part of it's a conceptual and intellectual problem, which is just getting one's mind around the idea that the core of this global value chain exercise is actually services. So, to try to answer your question a little bit more specifically based on that, you need a perspective which integrates your services trade rules with your manufacturing trade rules, and even indeed with your agricultural trading rules. They have a bit of trouble updating the agricultural trading rules even to the 20th century, let alone the 21st century, so perhaps we could leave that to one side for the moment. But in terms of trade rules, you really want to look at investment and professional services and logistics and transport together with your manufacturing rules and have a perspective on it which puts that at the centre of negotiations. One of the odd things about the WTO negotiations, and there are plenty that are odd about them, but one of the odd things was that people thought of manufacturing rules as being about lowering industrial tariffs, and they dealt with that in a separate box. And they thought about services, and they dealt with that in a separate box. And services was left to one side as something that was done by request and offer. In other words, somebody would knock on your door and say, would you do something for me? And the person would reply, well, I'll think about it, but not quite yet. And the major focus was on getting rid of a few industrial tariffs, and that proved to be very difficult. I don't think the services industry ever really thought that what was going on in a so-called industrial tariffs negotiation was about their business. Not perhaps the tariff so much, although that affected their business, but essentially when you were worrying about how to make manufactured goods cross borders at lower cost, you needed to do that from a services perspective. So I think a total change of perspective, it's easy to say what's needed, actually doing it's a harder question, I'm glad you didn't ask that, but you need to change that perspective, put services absolutely at the centre of the rules, and think about it the way businesses think about it, which is what are the coordinated set of services sectors and manufacturing rules from the traditional area that facilitate trade in the most valuable sectors of the economy and do them together. Now, at the multilateral level, that hasn't happened. At the regional level, that is happening more and more, and you're going to come onto this, I think, with some of the regional negotiations, where you take that perspective. The challenge with the regional is it's a global world, so how do you bring those regional rules, such as they are, that might be more comprehensive to a multilateral level? But we can come back to that, I'm sure, later.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Crawford. I'll turn to Ronan now, because you'll have a perspective, obviously, from the accountancy profession, working with Chartered Accountants Ireland, and you've heard of some of the reasons why we need to update trade rules and some of the benefits that come from it, reducing costs and more value-added, better value-added chains, and the integration with other negotiations. But I'm just wondering, from your point of view in the profession in Ireland, what is it about the trade rules that you think are challenges for or impact the profession? And what sort of areas do you think that the profession could benefit from some sort of trade liberalisation?
Well, the whole area of trade is very significant in the context of Ireland. We would be a very open economy with very significant foreign direct investment coming in, and obviously international trade is very significant. And in that context, obviously, the firms in Ireland will be working very hard to facilitate international trade and provide services to those multinational enterprises in Ireland. So one of the challenges that I have come across recently would have been that a partner in a Big Four firm who was servicing big US multinationals on the West Coast who had similar investments in Ireland, he wanted to transfer to Ireland and to practice in the area of audit, where he had been an auditor for many years, I think 15 or 20 years in the US. And under our regulations, I have to say to him, your experience doesn't count, because under our regulations within the EU, you have to have experience that is recognised only within the European Union, which makes absolutely no sense when you stand away and look at it and say, is the firm gaining? Is the client gaining? Does it make sense in an international context? And yet they are the rules we are trying to work within. So that's one sense. So, but I mean, the value that the profession brings, be it in terms of accountability and service, I think these are hindered because, as was said already, all our regulations are structured either on a national level or perhaps to an extent within Europe, within an EU level. So when you look at audit regulations as to who can audit, it's structured within an EU framework, and that doesn't make sense when I'm looking at a US CPA with 20 years experience and I'm saying, I can't recognize that experience. That doesn't make any sense. So similarly, within the EU itself, we have a mandatory recognition. So anybody qualified as an auditor within the EU can move to any other member state and be recognized. And that's a positive development. It raises its own challenges, because how do I recognize a qualification from another part of Europe with a different language, a different education system, and so on? So one of the things certainly that's happening now, which is certainly welcome at the EU level, is that there is move to try to have some form of passport recognition. So when you're recognized within that context, that could be transferable more easily within the EU. And certainly in the context of what's been said, I think the profession has a role to play in pushing for a similar type of passport which would be easily recognized across the globe. Because that's what the industry needs, that's what the services need, and that's how we can serve our clients better if we do that.
Right. Thank you very much, Ronan. In fact, you touched on and talked about what one might consider to be a barrier, to trade and barrier to movement. So if I turn back to Peter and Crawford, just to explore this idea of barriers to trade that continue to frustrate the potential for professional services such as accountancy. And it seems like from what you're saying, and you were talking about the outdated rules, that it now seems to be less about sort of border import tariffs or perhaps even market access issues, but rather they're sort of behind the border domestic measures that are creating sets of complications. And I think Peter, you alluded to the regulatory issues, for example. I'm just wondering, again, Peter and Crawford, what are some of the demands and expectations that are placed on professional services providers, and particularly the accountancy profession, in operating around the world? I mean, we've heard of mobility, but what other ones are there that create these barriers to globalised provision of services?
Well, for every services business now, actually every business, being able to move data across borders is essential. And that's necessary both for internal company reasons. For example, if you need to move personnel information, you need to move financial information about the corporation across borders. But also, that's the way you're serving many of your customers. More and more businesses, and especially services businesses, are providing their services digitally across borders. Whether you're an architect in the middle of the United States that is providing architectural drawings to a customer in Europe or in Asia, you may be a healthcare business and you are getting second opinions from other countries, or you're having tests evaluated in other countries. But also if you are in manufacturing, you're doing that. You look at manufacturers such as, aircraft manufacturers, Airbus or Boeing. They are constantly in real time monitoring the performance of the engines on their airplanes. And they're doing that so they know when the engines need to be maintained. But I just learned recently that they're also doing it for other reasons, that part of the package that they provide is each year they will provide the airlines that have used their engines with advice on how to fly their planes more efficiently to save money, because they've been able to do that. They've collected this mass amount of data. So being able to move data across borders freely is essential for all services businesses, and indeed all businesses. But what we're seeing is a number of countries, many countries, are saying, well, wait a minute. If you are going to do business in our country, you're going to sell insurance, or you're going to provide accountancy services, or you're going to provide any other, you're going to do health services. You need to keep the data here in this country. We don't want you storing it somewhere else. We don't want you managing it somewhere else. And there are different reasons that countries are doing this. In part, they're doing it because they think it's going to be more secure in their country. But when you actually look at it, think about it. If you were operating a corporation, do you think you'd be able to keep data more securely if you had 3 places in the world where you were storing and processing your data, or 120? Well, it's pretty clear that it's easier to maintain security in 3 places than in 120. So for security reasons, it doesn't really make sense. Now, some countries also think, well, we need to be part of the digital revolution, and we can't have all of the operations happening outside our country. And that is also kind of a carryover to what Crawford was talking about, the old-fashioned way of looking at economies and production. That decades ago, countries thought, well, I have to have my own steel industry. I have to have my own automobile industry. And that isn't the way the world works now. You look at automobiles. In the U.S.-Canada relationship, the typical North American automobile moves across our border 6 times in the course of production. And that's just one example. That is typically the way the economies work today. Mm-hmm. Someone said, we no longer trade in goods. We trade in tasks. And that's really what is happening here. And the fundamental task these days is storing, processing, managing data. So that is for certainly our members in the services area, that's the number 1, the number 2, and the number 3 issue. But then we also talked about the regulatory issues. And that, of course, is a huge area where there is such diversity among countries that becomes an impediment to, well, as Ronan was saying, for any kind of service provider. So those are 2 of the areas, that so-called newer areas, that trade negotiators are going to have to address.
Thank you, Peter. Crawford?
Well, to your question, Gary, about particularly about the accounting profession, it's quite important not to get tangled up in linguistic debate, because sometimes when people talk about regulation, it means different things to different people, inevitably. The way that I would look at it is to say what you were describing as barriers to business, which is kind of analogous to a market access restriction. In the services sector, they're expressed often in regulations. So people say it's a regulatory issue. In a certain sense it is, because it's expressed in regulation. It's not there as a numerical barrier like it is with a tariff. But I think it's probably more helpful to describe some of those as being really like market access barriers. It's like they're at the border. So in the accounting profession, in particular, it's in the jargon of services people, it's barriers to commercial presence. It's stopping you setting up business. Now, it's expressed in regulation. It may be that it has restrictions on the managerial arrangements as to whether they have to be nationals, or it can be on even whether you can establish a business and be wholly owned, or whether it has to be a certain kind of partnership. In other words, it actually impedes you freely doing business the way you want to do business. And certainly in the accounting profession, that's still, as I understand it, a significant. If you went, I think, and talked to the industry, and you get a general view that that's still one of the most significant barriers. And yes, it's regulation, but it's not what I'd call deep regulation, which has to do with intrinsic national priorities. It's kind of a deliberate decision to make it more difficult for foreigners to do business. Now, they may be motivated by sometimes prudential reasons, but that's worth thinking of it as a market access barrier, and in accounting, it's still significant. I mean, the work that we have done, and I won't bore you with all of that now, but we'll come to it later when you can be bored with it. But if we've analysed what the size of the barriers are in a whole lot of services sectors, and certainly in the professional services sector, there are two that stand out in accounting. One is those kind of barriers, and the other one is the one you mentioned, which is the movement of people across borders. If you want to do businesses in accounting, you want to be able to move people who are the most professional and the most expert to the place where they need to do that business. Now, you may well take commercial decisions that you want to use people that are local, but you want to have the option of actually moving people with the right kind of expertise across borders to do particular tasks. So those two are still biggies, and there's still a lot of scope in those areas to reduce barriers if there's a will to do so, because effectively you're putting impediments to your own efficiency at a national level to be able to integrate into those value chains. So there are various techniques. Whether you decide, or governments decide, to liberalise just for the professional services sector when it comes to barriers to commercial presence is a national decision. Sometimes those are the results of general policies that are general investment policies that apply across the board. Sometimes they're very specific to the sector. So your target can either be a generalised approach or a specific approach, depending on what your priorities are and what the legislative basis is. And certainly on the movement of people across borders, you know, there's a technique which is often used, which is so-called mutual recognition agreements, whereby you try to provide equivalence across borders, and there are various techniques that you can use. And that allows good prudential reasons for doing things a particular way at a national level, but it stops what I'd call the kind of lazy protectionism in that area, which is, well, we'd really rather just like to keep all this stuff for ourselves. So pushing the boundaries on mutual recognition, particularly in the professional services sector, is a real issue. Now, that tends to happen regionally these days and bilaterally rather than multilaterally, but there is, you mentioned the teaser negotiations in Geneva, that's an area where that might happen. Now, it varies sector by sector. Peter's talked about cross-border data flows, which are a real issue in a lot of other sectors. In an area like telecommunications, it's quite different. It's the way in which you have a regulatory framework that's pro-competitive. So for the telecommunications sector, your real priority for getting rid of restrictiveness and making your sector more significant at the global level is to have the right kind of pro-competitive legislation in place. You wouldn't worry quite so much about barriers to commercial presence or movement of people across borders. It's a little bit of horses for courses, but generally the move, as Peter has said, is in all sectors that business that used to be conducted by investing, going in and doing business, still happening, still very significant, but it's now happening across those borders in ways that people never imagined it would happen. You can now, whether it's media, whether it's business, it's now able to occur across borders, largely through the internet. So in actual fact, having a capacity to make sure there are no barriers introduced there is very significant. Perhaps at the moment less so for some professional services, but I suspect even there, in terms of the software that's involved and the way in which businesses that have global reach, like accounting, do their business, means that they have to be able to transmit massive amounts of data across borders freely without feeling that it's going to suddenly be disrupted. So I think it's an increasingly important issue, even though it might not figure at the moment as a top priority, even in an area like professional services.
Great. Thank you very much, Crawford. It's interesting, you used a term then when you were talking that made me think that with the data flows issue, with the mobility issue, and with the regulatory issues that you've mentioned, that they are all forms of what you might call disguised protectionism in a way then, that they're protecting or trying to protect, national arrangements or protect national interests in a way that creates a protectionist approach. And I think I'd like to drill down on those three particular issues we've talked about then: regulation, data flows, and mobility. And I might ask each of you individually then to talk about a different one and perhaps relate it back to the accountancy profession more directly. And I think I'll start with you, Crawford, because you were talking about regulation. You were talking about boring us a bit with some work or research that the OECD had done. So it'd be great to hear from you then about that work and how it relates to the accountancy profession. And I think that work you talk about is the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. Crawford?
Well, one of the things which is enormously important when you're trying to change the way in which people adopt their policies, let alone to negotiate, is being able to apply a metric. One of the reasons why tariff negotiations for manufactured goods always kind of seemed technically rather easy was because you were able to compare each other's tariff. It was, it was a common metric. You say, well, you've got a 10% tariff, I've got a 5% tariff. You can halve yours, and I won't do anything, of course. That's usually the opening position. And then the end position these days is nobody does anything. But no, more seriously, you can apply a formula approach, and you can say, here's an efficient way to actually liberalise, we'll all make a 50% reduction. And then from a political perspective, being able to put a number on something does rather focus the mind. I'm not saying it leads to immediate change, but even in agriculture, when you had something which told you what the percentage of subsidy was to the value of agricultural production, you would suddenly say, you mean to say that, we know we have an agricultural policy that's there to protect our farmers, but it's 200% the value of production? Ooh, that's a bit embarrassing. So if you've got a number which gives you a political focus for the cost and a technical device, an exchange rate, if you like, to enable you to negotiate, it's terribly advantageous. In services, we've never had that. And now what we've done is we have created something which is not perfect. We call it the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. But basically for 18 sectors, it'll be 19 by the end of the year, and across 40 economies, we now have a common measure. It's been adopted by all the OECD members. It's not just created by the Secretariat, it's owned by the members, a common basis, so you can compare the restrictiveness across sectors and across countries numerically. And that was something we released in the middle of this year. We do it on a scale of 0 to 1. So you can see whether you're 0.7, 0.5, 0.3, 0.2, and you can see at a glance on a bar graph which, you know, in front of ministers, that's something that's quite useful. I mean, officials can spend hours in front of ministers telling them 73 things they ought to do. But, you know, when there's a bar graph which says, here's you, here's the US, here's China, you can see pretty well how you rate. And you can see at the national level where the bottlenecks are, where your most restrictive sectors are. So that's enough by way of advertising for the product. Go to the internet, have a look. It's very useful. It's massively detailed, and it also has a high level of aggregation. What we've done is we have actually provided a quantitative estimate of a lot of these regulatory barriers. And in the accounting sector, I suppose generally it's in the moderate range of restrictiveness compared to some other sectors. Particularly a lot of OECD members are relatively liberal. But still, on a scale of 0 to 1, it averages out around 0.3. Which, when you think about it, that's 30% of a 0 to 1 scale. So there's still serious restrictiveness there across borders. And even among OECD members that are relatively liberal in services, even the most liberal still have significant restrictions there. So it brings home the story that if you want to improve your competitiveness, even if you've managed to get a pretty liberal financial services regime, if you've got good telecommunications, still, even in those hardcore areas, there are those barriers to movement of people, in particular across borders in the professional services area. And focusing in on what elements might make some changes there without disrupting your regulatory framework enables a new discussion to take place, I think, if people have the political will to do it. And what we've done is we have dissected it into what I would call real hardcore regulatory areas, which are whether or not you're transparent in how you produce your regulation, whether you produce your regulatory arrangements in advance, give people time to comment on them, provide a rationale for why you have it, have appeal system in place that enable private sector actors to complain about particular decisions. Even things like that. So you can focus in and say, well, maybe there are things we can do there which don't undermine our total regulatory framework, and you could actually reduce your restrictiveness accordingly. And then, of course, there are the more hardcore ones, which I discussed before, which are commercial restrictions. And then there are what I call the secondary restrictions, particularly in the accounting area, you know, fee fixing, restrictions on advertising, and so on. So those kind of issues can be focused in separately, and you can say, well, this one's a bit hard, this one's perhaps a bit easier to find an optimal way, and you can therefore devise approaches that would enable you to see at a glance how much you would reduce your level of restrictiveness by. So you can say, look, I don't like the fact that I'm kind of in the top third. What can I do to get down to about halfway? And you can make a rough estimate of the kind of measures you would need to take to be as competitive as country X by making those changes. So it's a tool that you can use. You can use it at a national level because it's in your own interest to do it that way, or you could do it as part of a negotiation that enables you perhaps to have political reasons to do something that you might not be able to summon up if you're on your own.
Great. Thank you, Crawford. Peter, I'll turn to you to talk about data flows because you were the one that mentioned problems with sharing of information or challenges with sharing of information across borders and what some people are doing. And again, if we can just talk about it more generally, what are some of those challenges for sharing information? And if you could also relate it to the accountancy profession, are there examples where it really impacts the accountancy profession?
Well, it seems to me that the accountancy profession is one which, because especially there is an international market for accountancy, there is the need to be able to transfer data so that an accountant firm which has a global customer, an international company, is servicing that company in many jurisdictions and has to be moving data back and forth across jurisdictions to verify the audits and to even conduct the audits and share information. And so a couple of things. One, if it can't do that, if it is got to keep the information of its work in Korea and its work in Japan, then it really can't serve that corporate customer properly. So that would be one example. I mentioned also the security. And obviously, in this profession, giving customers the assurance that their data is going to be kept secure, confidential, is essential. And it becomes much harder to do that if you have to have the data stored and processed in individual jurisdictions. So there is a real need to be able to move the data across borders. We are seeing increasingly, though, that countries feel that they need to impose the kind of restrictions that you keep the data in their jurisdiction. Now, in some cases, that means you won't even go into a country to serve it. I remember talking to a banker who said, we have 5 branches in Nepal. And he said, you know, if we have to keep all our data and store it and manage it in Nepal for 5 branches, we are not going to serve that market. And of course, that hurts all the different parts of the Nepalese economy. I'm just using this as an example, but it's true in a lot of other countries, that every other business depends upon the services of accountancy or of banking, and if they don't have those services, except locally, the rest of the economy is going to suffer. Now, the approach that we as the Services Coalition advocate is that countries in these various trade negotiations that we'll talk about later should take on an obligation to guarantee that companies can provide move data across borders. Now, there also do have to be certain regulations and exceptions. And for example, for law enforcement, for certain prudential reasons. But the nature of the data and the technology today is you can provide that to law enforcement officials instantaneously from any place in the world. Similarly, if you're talking about prudentially required information. And so you should be able to process it wherever you want, subject to certain exceptions, which are then provided, and they exist already, actually, in the World Trade Organization. In the current GATS, the General Agreement on Trade and Services, there is a section on exceptions, which says that for reasons of prudential reasons, for law enforcement, for safety for consumer protection and so forth, governments can insist on having access to the data. And so our view is that that is plenty adequate for companies to adhere to the rules of the various jurisdictions. Unfortunately, a lot of the countries have other reasons for wanting to require you to have the data in their country. And some of it is for basically protectionist reasons, and some of it is they want to be able to control content. And this will get us, I think, into a whole other area that is very important, and that is the whole question of how the internet is regulated or not. And maybe we get into that a little bit later, but that is also, this whole question of internet governance is one that is essential for all companies. Now, right now, a lot of the tech-oriented companies are involved in that, and a lot of other companies haven't been so involved. But there is a movement afoot to put much more regulations on the internet, treating it almost as a public utility, and that is not how the internet has succeeded as this huge force for innovation and for business internationally. So I would also mention that as one part of the data issue broadly defined that companies, including accountancy firms, need to start paying attention to.
Great. Thank you very much, Peter. And I'll turn to Ronan to ask about mobility, specifically within the accountancy profession. drawing on your experience of working for a professional accountancy organisation that has negotiated these mutual recognition agreements that Crawford mentioned, and as well as being involved in the Common Content project in Europe, just wondering whether you can give us an insight into some of the specific challenges that you've seen with respect to mobility of professional services.
I think given the national framework from which we all come, we tend to assume, I think every professional body would probably say its members are the best or different in some way. I think one of the great benefits of working with others and collaborating is you realize we have so much in common, and indeed we can learn so much from one another. So I worked with leading accountancy bodies across the world to put in place some mutual recognition agreements for our members, for their members to come to Ireland and for our members to go overseas. And certainly from my perspective, we would see that as an institute, attracting young people into the profession, which is so important to where we're going. Young people today, graduates, want mobility. They want a qualification that will give them mobility. Accountancy does that, but obviously it needs to be backed up by a mutual recognition agreement, and that's one of the reasons why we work so hard in that space. And that provides a level of clarity of quality across the jurisdictions, and everybody benefits from that. Within the context of the EU, as I said earlier, there is a directives which basically say that all accountants, or certainly auditors, have ability to be recognized in all member states. And behind that then was perhaps, well, are we all the same? So to deal with that, we worked with leading bodies across the EU within the Common Content project to define a common syllabus, a common learning framework, which we all signed up to and is overseen in a transparent way. And in so doing, we can then say, well, if you train in France or in Germany or in Ireland, you should be equivalent. And indeed, if you're working within that firm, they will have assurance that when you transfer from one country to another, and indeed if you're training in one country and in another at the same time, those types of experiences can be recognized. Because the rules we're operating on essentially are framed that you will train in Ireland only, or you will train in France only, and the reality is the world we're in has moved. Both firms and trainees want to have mobility, and we have to be able to facilitate that. So it's really important, I think, that we step away from our national selfish perspective and think, where do we need to get to? Where's the value add? And I think the needs of business, at the end of the day, drive the whole thing, and we have to support the firms, and indeed the firms themselves, as we said earlier, are looking and saying, well, I want the best people to be able to serve this client here, and we have to find structures to make that happen.
Great. Thank you, Ronan. Just one last question to the three of you before we turn to Pierre to wrap up the discussion. There's a number of trade negotiations currently underway or recently being concluded, and some of the ones that have been in the press include the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, the TTIP, which is the transatlantic trade negotiations. We've already mentioned TISA, the Trade in Services Agreement, and discussions that are ongoing there. And there's many other sort of bilateral and regional negotiations, in the ASEAN region, in East Africa, and so on. I'm just wondering again, looking at it from the accountancy point of view, first of all, what are your views just on those negotiations and the current approaches to those negotiations, and how services and in particular professional accountancy services feed into those negotiations? And what is it that perhaps we as a profession, what opportunities are there for us to feed into or to influence what goes on in those discussions? So Peter, could I turn to you first?
Sure, thank you. Well, the frustrating thing, of course, is that services have been sort of under negotiation in the World Trade Organization. Under the Doha round, I guess now it's 14 years? 13 years, 14 years, who's counting? And it's been very frustrating because the negotiating premise has been nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. In other words, it's what they call a single undertaking, that if there were agreement on accountancy services, you would have to wait until the negotiations on agricultural subsidies were successful, as well as the negotiations on intellectual property. And that, of course, the premise of that was that then you'll have all of these, something for everybody, but that means you've got to have everybody on board with the something that they want. And so, as a result, we don't have a result. So that's been a very frustrating situation, and so as a result, many countries have said, well, we will negotiate on those areas that are most important to us, and we will negotiate with those parties that are like-minded in terms of the focus of the negotiation, the level of ambition, and so forth. So let me say that for all businesses, the first best solution is a multilateral solution. But businesses aren't going to just wait around forever for negotiators. And so what we're seeing is more and more of various either plurilateral negotiations among like-minded countries, or regional negotiations, or bilateral negotiations. Now, that, of course, creates a real challenge for anybody who is interested in a particular area, such as services. And so what it means is it's necessary to be following and engaging with the negotiators in all of these negotiations. So, for example, you have the TISA, the so-called Trade and Services Agreement. That is being undertaken by 50 countries within the WTO. 28 of those countries are the European Union. But that group of countries, which is developed countries and a number of developing countries, covers 70% of world trade and services today. So if you can get a strong result in the TISA negotiations, and you can do comparably the same in other negotiations, for example, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that has a certain overlap of countries, but it also has some additional countries in Asia and the Pacific. And so if we're able to get basically similar, coherent provisions on services at a high ambition in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in the TISA, and also in what is called the TTIP, the transatlantic negotiation, you would cover the vast majority of services that are provided internationally. Now, the missing countries would be some of the emerging economies, which of course have the most promise in the future. But if one were to get this critical mass of countries at more or less the same level of ambition, one would be a long, long way toward establishing de facto what the rules would be internationally in services. And hopefully at some point that could be folded into the WTO. So there is that opportunity. But the accountancy profession does need to engage in these negotiations. And by engage, what I mean is to talk to the negotiators. In the first instance, the negotiators from your respective countries, but also all of the negotiators. And we have done at our Coalition of Services Industries and others in similar organizations in Europe, in Canada, in Japan, is go to Geneva, meet with the negotiators. They actually are very eager to know about your business. They're out there negotiating, and Crawford kind of alluded to this. We're used to negotiating in traditional ways. But what we have found is when we do workshops in Geneva with the negotiators, whether it is on data flows or some other aspect, the negotiators show up and they are really eager to know about what you need for your businesses. So I would really urge you to engage, not just with your own representatives, but also with the other negotiators. And there's one very particular thing in accountancy. 20 years ago, there was an agreement on various, what they call is disciplines on domestic regulations and accountancy. And basically those disciplines were the sort of good governance practices that Crawford was talking about. Well, that was agreed almost 20 years ago, but it hasn't been adopted by the WTO because of this single undertaking thing. Well, two things. One would be advocate that the WTO go ahead and put it into force, and the other is look to that as a model for the negotiations that I just mentioned in the TPP and the TISA and the TTIP. So there are some practical things that the profession can be doing, and this, of course, would deal with some of the issues that Ronan was mentioning. So that would be my suggestion.
Great. Thank you, Peter. Crawford, do you have something to add to Peter's comments?
Not a lot, but I'll take a long time saying very little. It's the trade negotiator in me. No, I mean, I think the obvious, it's almost pointless to say it, but it still needs to be said. The paradox is that the world now, more than ever, ought to be pursuing a multilateral approach. I mean, in terms of what we've just been discussing, there is no regional arrangement that is optimal from this point of view. I would think from most business perspectives, they would say, well, yes, we operate in a globalized world. Let's do this in a globalized way, which do it multilaterally. I'm a little bit, this is a very personal view, I'm always a little bit still feel that there ought to be more oxygen breathed into that if it was possible than is currently the case, but political reality seems to be otherwise. But I still think it's always useful at events like this for a few kind of sad and lonely voices such as my own to sort of remind people that this still would make a hell of a lot more sense than anything else that people are doing. Because if people stop saying it, it will certainly never happen. But I'm very realistic. I think the reality is, as Peter has described, for various reasons, that's not working. And you can't stop people doing something in the absence of it. And that is essentially now regional and to some extent plurilateral. It remains to be seen how successful that regional approach is. I think from the point of view of business, there will eventually be a day, hopefully not too far off, where the real challenge will be, okay, we've now got these regional blocks. How do we build them into something multilateral? That'll be the next generation that has to deal with that. I will certainly be long retired or gone to meet my maker by the time they get around to that. But I think that I still think will be the really big challenge, and certainly for business, because it operates globally. Production tends to often be regional, but ultimately you're selling across the globe, so you really need to have that in place. And I think if the TISA can be successful, which is certainly plurilateral at the moment, but it's not a small plurilateral. It should, and one hopes it will eventually, encompass some players who are not presently in it, not least of which China. And if and when that happens, then you really are dealing with effectively pretty close to a global economy anyway. So I think that's certainly important. Second thing, I'm glad you asked this question. I love questions which are about what other people can do. The only thing I would suggest, and it's more in ignorance than in knowledge, but I tend to think that the accounting profession in particular, and I know it means a lot of work, but I would never underestimate the effect of a global approach from the profession, which says, look, when we're operating in various jurisdictions, these are things which we as a profession collectively, not just representatives of this firm or that firm, think is a reasonable approach which has the consensus of the business. Now, getting that consensus is not probably a lot easier for the profession than it is for the government representatives, but I suspect it'll be a bit easier. And I know there are plenty of bureaucrats, when they hear the story that you will come to tell them, will try and put it to the bottom of the file. But if there's an active agenda there, I actually think it helps governments, because they will face a situation where the bureaucrats across the table from them will say, oh, we can't do that because there are prudential reasons why we have to do it this way, or it's politically very difficult. But you say, but hang on a minute, your own industry is okay with this. They say if you did it this way, that would actually work for us. So what's your problem? So, I mean, it's easy to say in the abstract, but I know from the past work that your profession has done that there are some very helpful things that have been done there. And I think in time, with patience, they make a difference, particularly in the harder core regulatory areas where you're not saying open up your market to investment, but saying when it comes to a mutual recognition agreement, you could take the following avenues to see whether it works. When it comes to the licensing regime, this is the way it could be administered. If you're coming to a partnership arrangement, these are the ways in which the partnership could be less restrictive than otherwise, and yet still meet all your objectives. If there's a consensus among the profession for that, I think it's a lot harder for governments to resist it out of laziness or whatever the rationale may be. Finally, I come from the OECD, so I would say this. It doesn't only have to be negotiation, okay? And again, this goes to the profession as well. At the end of the day, it's better to do it multilaterally, but you can do it yourself. You can do yourself a favour by actually providing optimal conditions to be attractive, whether it's to the best professional advice on accounting, or to the best financial services providers, or the most efficient logistics system. And that's what sensible governments want to do. They find it difficult for political reasons to do it, but it helps them if the professional organisations advise them sensibly as to how it can be done. And you don't need to wait 5, 10, 15 years for a negotiation to do this stuff. You can do it. And that should never be underestimated, whether it's in the services sector or in an agricultural sector or whatever. Governments can and still should do this. The G20 still talk about doing this. They have a goal at the moment, which is allegedly to improve their growth prospects. What could they do to improve their growth prospects? They don't have to wait for a negotiation. They could reform their services sectors. That's where they're going to get the biggest bang for the buck quickly. And whether your professional organisations or others, telling governments that and reminding them of that sure would be doing everybody a favour.
Great. Thank you very much, Crawford. And Ronan, do you have anything to add then from the profession's perspective in particular?
Well, I suppose I could say some of the things I've spoken about already is happening, but I do think there is a piece where the profession and the firms together collectively could do it. I think equally I would see that work is already referred to by Peter, how work goes from one place to another. So services are moving anyway, and firms are looking at how they can lower their costs and move those services across borders. So to an extent, some of these things are already happening, and I think over time we'll see, particularly with the advances of technology, massive movements of work. I think the concern, short-term concern always within professions is, well, what does this mean for me? That's somebody else has taken my job. I think, as was said yesterday, what we're seeing is really the challenge for the profession is always to keep moving up the value chain. If we say we're going to keep doing the same thing, well, clearly we're going to be passed by. So we have to look up the value chain, and I think that's the opportunity to provide the best services, as we just said, to the best firms, and in that way look after everybody's interest, including our own.
Great. Thank you, Ronan, and thank you for the three of you for that engaging discussion. We've gone a little over time, but there's still 15 minutes or so left in the session, and I'd love to turn to Pierre now to, as I said at the start, bring the session together, discuss some of the broader international economy and business trends that are pushing for what we call the reimagining of the current trade agenda, and from your experience in politics, where and how do politics feed into this?
Well, thank you very much, Gary. I'll try to be shorter, but I can't promise. I just want to tell you how very impressed I've been by the discussion we've just been having. I've been very happy to be here close to you guys, because this conversation has reached me in all of what has been my career. I have spent half of my career in the private sector, always with accountants, and the other half in the government and the public sector. And because I was at Deloitte before I was in the government. So I was at Deloitte. I went 10 years as a Minister for International Trade. We got to know one another at that time. And after I left the government, I did something that normally foreign ministers don't do. Prime ministers and foreign ministers in Canada normally go to a law firm. Right? You know, you go counsel at a law firm. You don't have the independence rules, and you know, accounting firms and financial services firms have independence. I chose to come back to Deloitte, and I have appreciated this conversation precisely because it reaches me with the 35 years of what has been my career, always around trade, or most of it, but by two hats. And what I've liked of the conversation today is that it reached out both to business and to government. My view is that the healthiest way and the best possible development we can have is when we have a healthy and good dialogue between government and private sector. And that dialogue is not evident. Sometimes I have the impression sometimes you have a very schizophrenic guy before you. I mean, the half I was in the government, I had the impression I was always explaining the private sector and defending and promoting the private sector. Mostly as trade minister, that's what you do in a government. And the other half, in the private sector, I feel I have to explain why governments exist and, you know, how important it is that they have. So there I am with this half-and-half approach, but realizing how this dialogue is absolutely important. Now, since 25 years ago, we were celebrating the fall of the Berlin Wall and the implosion of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. And what has happened since then, over 25 years? Globalization has been the theme of international relations with trade. I love it. I've been an international trade guy since reading Tintin when I was young. I thought that international affairs and trade were the thing to do with my life. And globalization, with the much deeper integrated economy we're in, has actually raised 2 billion people above the poverty line, 400 million fewer poor in China alone. So we have done through international trade, integration of trade, and the technology that came up more than any of our development policy and what the missionaries before had tried to do. So we have to pay a lot of attention to international trade. And as a business, we do have to pay a lot of attention to international trade because of the integration. Peter, you were talking about a car which between Canada and the United States moves 4 times. You will remember that when I was international trade minister, I discovered that cows too move between Canada and the US 4 times by the age of 18 months. And you know why I know that? Because all of a sudden we got a mad cow disease, a mad cow in Alberta. And at first, of course, it's very perilous for our border because mad cow, well, immediately the American border shuts. The poor cows were waiting at the border. They couldn't move where they belonged for that period of their lives. But at the same time, that helped us resolve the issue with the American administration at the time in a very resolute and positive manner, because we realized that the poor cow fell sick in Canada, but I mean, it wasn't a Canadian cow, it was just a non-American cow that got sick. But that's the kind of world we've been moving into very much. But so international trade is becoming more complex with the issues you have raised. It requires more sophistication in its understanding than we were negotiating tariffs and elements that are like more physical, but they are extremely important and fundamental, and certainly to the profession. You know why I came back to Deloitte after the government? Even though there were independence rules and more complications as an advisor, as a counsel, because I think accountants have been ahead of the curve of globalization long before. They have created this interdependent world before even the governments got at it. And they're very business-oriented. I mean, I'm not an accountant myself, but I saw some people having this badge walking in here. It was written, "I love accounting." Well, I love accountants because they, first of all, what I noticed too is that when you are in a law firm, they look at you and you say, oh, you're not a lawyer. They look down on you if you're not one of them. And an accounting firm, very often they're not the majority in their own firm. So, I mean, there's no second-class citizen there. So I felt okay. But it's also more business-oriented. So what I would like to say at how important it is to engage. And yes, we are now and I'm in Italy, so I'll use an Italian image. The multilateral system still works very well for the dispute settlement body. I think we have to recognize that the dispute resolution still works, and things happen in services. Right now I'm chairing a panel at the WTO, Panama against Argentina in financial services. And it will create jurisprudence and elements because, we're beginning to have cases like that. So we should pay attention to the World Trade Organization and certainly the dispute settlement body. I hope very much we make progress down the line. On the negotiating front, I was in Doha as well for the launch. Unfortunately, I was also in Cancun, where we miserably failed. But trade is irrepressible. So if we could not deliver at the multilateral level, what has happened is that, of course, the WTO has been signified of 253 plurilateral, bilateral, regional trade arrangements, 253 under the WTO. The GATT had received 24 notifications. I mean, we are at 24 a year instead of 3 a year, notifications like that. So my image, because we're in Italy, is now we have a spaghetti ball of negotiations where we may try to bring in cohesiveness on the trade in services and international trade in services. But you have to pay a lot of attention to make sure that these are cohesive, that they make sense. And this is where your federation, the IFAC, has a role to make sure that we don't go in all kinds of directions, because one of these days, what I do hope very much is that we repatriate all of these agreements where they belong in the first place, which would be at the WTO in Brussels. For me, that would make a lot of sense. So I commend the accountants for having been ahead of the curve of an integrated and global economy. And I would urge you to maintain that leadership in your dialogue, both with your business and private sector organizations, to promote the right way of going about it. And this has been said by the panel. You wouldn't know how much a minister feels lonely sometimes alone with his officials. And I beg to say this in the presence of very respected ones. Sometimes we die for either being comforted that the advice we're getting meets the test of the reality of the business. Sometimes we need other ideas coming from people who are in the practice. So I think from and sometimes as well, and I will conclude on this. Wow, not too bad actually, but I'll conclude on this. The trade minister, and I have not only lived that myself as Canada's trade minister, many trade ministers around the world will be the same thing. At the cabinet table, the trade minister is the allies of the private sector. It's the allies of business. We have to fight with other cabinet ministers. We have to push the envelope and struggle to convince our own cabinet colleagues who sometimes will have, I mean, in Canada, because we're pretty centrist, we will put as Minister of Social Services a leftist, and we put at trade someone who is sort of more conservative within the balance. So you must not let them, you must feed them the arguments that will help the trade minister promote the right agenda at his own cabinet table and move the clock in the right direction.
Great. Thank you very much, Pierre. It sounds like it sounds like from the last comments from all the panelists that there is certainly something for the profession to do, and we need to get in there and to try and influence and to bring forward our position, our points, and to describe clearly why it's so important for the profession. So thank you very much. And unfortunately, we're not going to have time to take any questions from the audience, but I think if things have worked out properly, I should have some gifts to present to our panelists. Just looking for... No, well, I should have had some. I was told that they would be here at the end of the session, but...
we don't need a gift.
Well, yeah. You will be getting one. Anyway,
the audience is
if you could put your hands together, please, for Peter, Crawford, Ronan, and Pierre. Thank you very much.